Hi, welcome to your last official video for COMM 363. Maybe two videos, maybe just one. I don't know yet. Anyway, we've been talking about the history of animation in this class, and that means by necessity, we've been talking about the distant past. But today, we are going to make it to the present day, because these days when we think about animation, what do we generally think about? Computer animation. Now, when we think about computer animation, often today we're thinking about the integration of live action, live filmed action with animated elements of some kind, digital elements that have been added in post-production. But as you know, we've seen the combination of live action and animation over and over again, from the Fleischers Out of the Inkwell to Disney's Alice series. And we've also seen in-camera optical effects with things like George Méliès's Trip to the Moon and all of the trick films that we saw at the very beginning of the class. So this idea of integrating live action with animation is in no way new to us. So we can think of these films as the ancestors of CGI and special effects. Now, the first fully computer animated feature film was Toy Story in 1995, and ever since, Pixar has been one of the dominant innovators in the field of computer animation. But Toy Story helped establish conventions of three-dimensional computer animation. 3D in the sense of an impression of depth, not flat figures, but round figures. And of course, this film had a profound effect on the field, so we'll get to that. But there is way more to talk about here than Pixar, of course. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to take you briefly through the history of computer animation, stopping at some interesting things along the way. And as always, I will mention that there is much more to this than I'm going to mention in this video. So there are many rabbit holes for you to go down here if this is something that you're interested in. CGI, here we go. Can you imagine a world without CGI? I don't want to. Anyway, CGI is computer-generated imagery. So before we delve into entirely CG-created worlds, there's a few things that I want to say about the way that it meshes with live action, because it creates several effects for live action pictures. For one thing, it lowers the cost of certain things that would otherwise require reshooting. That means that you can fix mistakes, basically. You can change lighting, you can change all sorts of stuff after the fact. It allows you to create fictional or past landscapes that you could not make using optical techniques. Say you're making the feature film Sweeney Todd. You really want to make a movie about people baking people into pies, but you need to show 19th century London. CGI is there for you. You can also create objects and figures that never existed and never could have been rendered realistically before. Now, I will also say that what an audience considers to be realistic changes according to what they're accustomed to. We are currently accustomed to incredibly realistic looking CG. But previously, audiences were accustomed to accepting, slightly less photorealistic effects as real, at least for the time being. How do I know this? I've been watching Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones with my children. I feel like that's all I need to say to you. Anyway, we can integrate these elements seamlessly into live action photography or create an entirely CG world, which we'll get to in a bit. Now, there are lots of different ways that information gets into the computer via a digital artist. For one thing, you might scan an image of a 3D model. This is from a 1999 Stanford project that sought to scan an image of Michelangelo's David into a computer, thereby getting closer to his face than anyone really wanted to. I mean, honestly, that was designed to be many feet away from a viewer. You might also draw on a digital tablet. You might also build a wireframe image and render a surface onto it. We'll come back to this in a bit with Future World. We might use motion capture in order to capture the performance of a given actor. You can see here that we have stuck dots all over Robert Downey Jr. in order to know where to place the Iron Man suit. Here's an example of motion capture in Avatar and performance capture, which is the term that we use for the capture of facial movements as well. You can see here that Bill Nye in Pirates of the Caribbean Dead Man's Chest has a ton of dots all over his face. Those dots will then be used as points of reference so that then when he is Davy Jones, who has a locker, I don't know if you've heard, can have facial movements that look quote-unquote realistic, or at least look convincing to an audience. We might also use motion control to program a computer to repeat camera movements, we'll see that with gravity, or model movements. And this kind of programming of movement is really important when it comes to the generation of crowds. We randomize the movement of a crowd so that the crowd of orcs, for instance, looks quote-unquote realistic. I should also say that when I'm using the term realistic here, it's a contested term because that has to do with perception, and perception of realism changes over time. For more on this, take Film History 1 and 2, in which we talk about realism all the time. Anyway, we might also use a green screen. We've got one of those downstairs in the studio. If you haven't messed around with the green screen, you're missing out. You should try it. Now we might also manipulate footage after the fact. We can use selective digital color grading to alter the color of shots or elements in shots. Have you ever wondered why movies are so incredibly orange and blue? Digital color grading is the answer. And here, digital color grading is being used to make Galadriel look positively luminescent. Anyway, you might also erase telephone poles and wires and that sort of thing. The Leica studios, for instance, will use stop motion animation, will use models, will use puppets, but then wires will be erased in post-production. Okay, so once basic material is digitized, you create the most important bits of movement. That's called keyframing. Remember, we talked about it before as keyframes as the most important points of movement, right? In digital animation, software will often fill in the frame between movements. This is Adobe After Effects, and this will give some of you hives. But we use the term keyframing for digital animation as well. Other programs can add color, texture, and lighting. Here's another important piece of vocabulary. Previs or animatics is a pre-visualization that allows somebody to see how a special effects sequence or how a heavily animated sequence will look without having to do all of the complicated detailed rendering. It's essentially an animated storyboard. We call animatics rough computer-generated versions of a scene, and that's incredibly important when it comes to all of these CG-heavy movies. Because you know what? It takes time, it takes memory in order to render something in great detail. Now, it's important to note that the trajectory of CG development has been towards heightened photorealism. Lev Manovich, in his 2001 book, The Language of New Media, which I highly recommend if you're interested in CGI or digital media in general, he writes that computer animation must imitate two forms of reality, not just the simulation of scenes from real life that correspond to the shape, lighting, and movement of physical reality. So what that means is, does it look like the world? Does it move like the world? Does it have shadows and areas of highlight like an object would if it were sitting in that place in the real world? But it must also simulate cinematographic codes such as camera movement, conventions that we've been trained to regard as real representation over many years of Hollywood continuity of style. This emphasis on realism is also related to the fact that the history of CGI has its roots in two separate fields, the military and Hollywood, both industries that have a considerable amount of money at their disposal for research and development. Space simulators, interactive flight training simulators, and communication systems were developed in the military in the 1960s and 70s. Universities also played an important role in CG development. In 1961, Ivan Sutherland at MIT's Lincoln Lab started developing the Sketchpad program, which is generally considered the first interactive computer graphics program. And Edwin Catmull, who was initially famous in the field for work on surface representation at the University of Utah, was commissioned by American International Pictures in 1976 to design a wireframe 3D hand for the film Future World. He built upon the Sketchpad program that Ivan Sutherland invented, and he came up with this. Here's a clip.
Body of the jaw. The angle of the mouth at rest corresponds to the interval between the bicuspid teeth. The skin of the
I have the holograph on my screen.
separated from
Restructuring.
adjacent
Readouts
fibers.
normal.
Security reports that drugs were added.
Now, at the time, Catmull was the head of the New York Institute of Technology, but he was soon wooed away by George Lucas to head up the newly created computer development division of Industrial Light and Magic. I couldn't find a good picture of the computer development division, but this is a pretty good picture. Anyway, Catmull Software was behind the creation of the first digital map painting and computer graphics algorithms that would generate fire, mountains, and shoreline from fractal equations. This was for the film Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. I'll show you a bit of the sequence, which is referred to as the Genesis effect, and is the first extensive sequence of photorealistic computer animation to appear on the screen. Interesting things about this clip. It uses fractal technology, which plays upon the idea that an object looks more or less like a smaller version of itself. A tree sort of looks like a branch, that sort of thing. But the software effect is that they take one small CG object and allow it to generate and multiply randomly. And the camera movement around the sphere was inspired by the Voyager footage. They converted the Yale star catalog into XYZ coordinates to create the star field. And if you look closely, you can see that the Big Dipper is actually in the background. Now you can kind of sort of compare this to the Death Star 3D animation sequence in Return of the Jedi, which was actually written on the first computer that was specifically designed for high-resolution computer graphics. You want to know what it was called? It was called the Pixar, and it was developed by Ed Catmull. And Catmull, of course, became the first president of Pixar. I also want to mention the work of Alvy Ray Smith and Ed Emshwiller, who made a film called Sunstone in 1979 at the New York Institute of Technology with a grant from the Guggenheim Foundation. I'm going to show you a little bit of that, but the subject material was influenced by Eastern mysticism and concepts of enlightenment. This was one of the first CGI films to create a solid 3D object that spins in space. You can imagine how useful this is going to be for science fiction. So here is a bit of Sunstone. I mean, the goal here is less narrative clarity and more what we've become accustomed to with our experimental animation. They're after a feeling. They're messing around with the medium to see what it can do. Okay, and what has become a familiar refrain? That's all the time we have in this video. Please watch part 2.